Hello, everyone, and welcome to our McGuire-Woods webinar, After the Dust Settles, Federal Employment and Affirmative Action Post-Election Forecast. My name is Brian Barger, and I am a Labor and Employment and Affirmative Action partner here in our firm's Charlotte, North Carolina office. Joining me today is my fellow partner, Bill Doyle, also from our Labor and Employment and Affirmative Action team. In addition, joining from our McGuire-Woods consulting arm is Edward Hill, who serves as our Vice President for Federal Public Affairs. For individuals tuning in today who might not know a lot about our firm, separate from Bill and myself, we have an army of attorneys here at McGuire-Woods with 1,000+ folks in 26 offices with industry and substantive expertise across the business spectrum. We're also fortunate, frankly, to have a subsidiary, McGuire-Woods Consulting, with individuals like Edward, who provide public affairs, lobbying, communications, and other services to clients, hand in hand with the good work that we do on the legal side of the house. Regardless of your connection to us, whether that's the McGuire-Woods Consulting, or both, we are thankful to have you joining us today. On your screen, before we dive into our topics, let me mention a few items about the platform itself. If you take a look at the icons at the bottom, first you should see a resources icon. That includes a copy of the presentation deck itself. If you'd like, you're welcome to save the deck to your laptop, or you can print it and follow along during the presentation. Second, you should also see a Q&A icon at the bottom as well. You can use this to submit any questions that you have throughout the webinar. We'll be leaving all the questions to the end of the program, and we'll do our best to get what we can if time allows. But for any questions we don't have time to cover, and I'm sure there will be a lot of those, we'll follow up with you individually after the program is over. Please also note that this presentation is being recorded. We'll circulate a link to the recording together with the deck itself over the next day or so. Feel free to use this yourself, or if you like, you can share it with others. The more the merrier. So that's it for instructions. On to our agenda for today. Specifically, as a preview, what we're going to be talking about is the Biden transition team and leadership staffing, how that impacts our view of upcoming regulations, priorities, and enforcement. We'll talk about the election impact on prior Trump administration executive orders and agency guidance, what might stand, what might not. Likely Biden administration regulatory and enforcement priorities out of the box, and then some practical talking points and things to think ahead about for the year coming up. In short, we have a lot that we're going to be throwing at you for consideration, and we know that. Indeed, I had initially suggested to Bill and Edward that this webinar should be sponsored by one of our pharmacy clients, because every time I think about this, it just makes my blood pressure shoot up. But our aim, frankly, is to do the exact opposite. We want to help you begin to think and plan ahead of the curve as employers. So with that introduction in mind, I'm going to turn things over to Edward to help kick us off. Edward?
Thanks, Brian, for that overview. And first of all, thanks for having me. And thirdly, thanks to those who are tuning in. I'm going to first start by just talking a little bit about, again, as Brian mentioned, the Biden administration post-election insights. And so first and foremost, the presidential election, as most of you have been viewing the news, you could see that President-elect Biden has won the majority of the swing states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, and Arizona. I think with the exception of North Carolina. And so we'll see where that goes in the next election. But for the purpose of this conversation, just wanted to give an overview there. And, I talked a little bit about the implications of the Senate election. The having an opportunity to have a Democratic majority will heavily depend on the Senate winning Georgia's two seats. But even regardless of a win there will be a closely divided Senate next year, which we've seen in a number of the news reports. And so the elections in Georgia will be very, very key to a number of Biden's legislative and regulatory goals. as mentioned, implications of the Senate runoff. So speed and oversight of some of the appointments. If we have a majority Democratic Senate, some of Biden's initiatives are likely to pass muster, but a number of them it'll be an uphill battle. And so we'd love to sort of give, as far as legislation and rulemaking, we'll just have to wait and see what happens there. But a number of things that have been pushed by the Biden administration, again, will heavily depend on the outcome of the Senate races in Georgia. So moving on to the U.S. House races. Right now, the Democrats have remained in majority on the House of Representatives, yet it's a very slim majority. And as a matter of fact, Democrats, they failed to defeat a single Republican that lost in the 2018 election. And so overall, the House has remained in a majority and has about 223 seats to 220 seats, so a very slim majority. And many believe that in 2 years, there's a strong chance that the GOP will take over the majority in the House. And so, that will heavily depend on a lot of initiatives and legislative initiatives that Biden will push out as well. And so to just sort of cover the congressional committees of jurisdiction for labor, talk a little bit about the House Committee on Education and Labor. Bobby Scott from Virginia has been chair of the committee for a very long time. I doubt that we will see any changes in the leadership on the House side. Now, on the Senate side, there are a number of shakeups. And so the Help Committee on the Senate side, it'll be very interesting to see what new members are assigned to this committee, and even what members will likely take the gavel as far as chair. So as you can see here, Lamar Alexander, Republican from Tennessee, is retiring, and it's possible new chairs. Now, if the Senate is to wind up in Democratic hands and there's a Democratic majority in the Senate, Patty Murray will likely be the chair of Senate Help. She's next in seniority, and after her is she's next in seniority as far as a Democrat. She's a ranking member now. Now, as far as seniority on the Republican side, is Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky and Susan Collins from Maine. And so they've each expressed interest in other committee assignments. And so we will keep our eyes there to see, what comes of the Help Committee as far as changes. I think it's important to note that Senator Loeffler, who is up for re-election in Georgia, is a member of the Help Committee. So, she stands a chance to either rise in the committee ranks or lose her position on the committee if she loses the Senate race in Georgia. And so I think keeping an eye on the Senate Help will be key for close attention to any labor initiatives coming in the Biden administration. One thing I will say is, and I've said this before, President-elect Biden is not new to working across party lines. And so even in a Republican Senate, I think we still see a lot of movement and a lot of initiatives. Will pass congressional muster. And so next, we'll talk a little bit about key Biden nominations. And the first is OMB director nominee. And I'm going to turn that over to Bill and Brian to sort of give you a little bit of context on why the OMB director nominee will be of importance here.
Thanks, Edward. So the OMB director is really important from a labor and employment perspective, because that role kind of has, I would say, two fundamental aspects of it that really are critically important. Number one, any kind of significant rulemaking or even some significant guidance may involve oversight by OMB certainly any rulemaking would require OMB approval. Information collection requests would involve OMB approval. And so this role is really critically important from a regulatory perspective, but also from a sub-regulatory and informal policy and enforcement perspective. We've seen in other administrations, like for example the Clinton administration, OMB played a really strong role in interacting with the business community and sometimes working to rein in what were viewed as aggressive DOL enforcement initiatives, even those aspects that didn't rise to kind of formal rulemaking. There's also a director of OIRA that will be a really important role within OMB that would be in charge of information collection and other regulatory review activities. And that individual hasn't been identified by the president-elect yet, but the near tandem is kind of a very known quantity in Washington regulatory circles. You can see she's got a lot of experience, and she's in charge of a think tank, that the Center for American Progress, that is a very influential think tank on the left, is in the middle of a lot of policy discussions that interact both with significantly with Capitol Hill and with the Democrat Party generally, and they're also funded significantly by corporate sponsorship, and so there is a connection. So she's getting kind of hammered from the announcement on both sides. So you've got progressives that don't like her because of the corporate kind of funding connection, and then you've got a lot of Republicans that are against her. I mean, in the Senate, Cotton has come out against her, and Lindsey Graham is against her. So this will, be an issue that comes up with regard to the control of the Senate in these Georgia races. It's on those Georgia races. It's interesting to note that Joe Manchin in West Virginia has said that he will not support an end to the legislative filibuster, which is still operative in the Senate, which means that legislation, including any kind of labor policy legislation, could still be subject to a Republican filibuster, even if both those Georgia seats go to the Democrat candidates in those races. But the nomination filibuster has now kind of basically died, and that would be important for a nominee like Tandem here. The next nominee is, the critically important role as the Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, and there's probably no doubt that she's going to be confirmed. Longstanding, Washington, she was chair of the Federal Board of Federal Reserve, and she has a lot of experience as a well-known entity in Washington. It's interesting in her announcement from a labor policy perspective that the focus, and one would expect the focus would be on economic recovery after the pandemic, and recovering from the pandemic and getting the economy back up. But her discussion was very focused as well on using the recovery as an opportunity to address what she was referring to as deeper structural problems involving economic inequality and racial and gender inequality, and including discussions about pay equity and employment equity for women and minorities. And, that's pretty significant coming from somebody at that level of a nominee, kind of at the right hand of power there in the White House, right next to the White House in Treasury. This role will be a critical role in the new administration. as it has been in the Trump administration, and the focus on these kind of labor policy issues at that high level does signify that you're going to see some White House-driven labor and employment initiatives, especially around equal employment opportunity, similar to what you saw in kind of the task force structure that was used in the Obama administration, like there was a White House task force on pay equity. I would expect that you'll see the same kind of White House-driven interagency structure that probably will include some folks from Treasury. So, Edward, I think it's over to you on the transition team here.
Sure. Thanks, Bill. And rather than go through all these names, we at least wanted to provide those tuning in with the names of those who are going to be, who are on the Department of Labor Employment Agency transition team. And so, as you can see, I mean, they're from a host of different backgrounds, from the private sector to nonprofits to education. And so we can expect a wide range of views on labor policy here, but I do want to focus on the DOL. And for those tuning in, this PowerPoint will be available to you. So sorry if we're sort of moving through this fast, but I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about Chris Liu, who is the Department of Labor Transition Team Lead. His background is with the Department of Labor. He served as a U.S. Deputy Secretary of Labor during the Obama administration. He was, before that, White House Cabinet Secretary and heavily involved with the DNC as a superdelegate. And so he'll be leading the charge on the transition team, and I think we can expect him to be heavily weighing in with Biden and his administration with regard to labor policy. And Brian, if you want to talk a little bit about, or Bill, if you want to talk a little bit about the EEOC and, potential changes there.
Yeah, so just before I get to that, let me talk just a second about some of the transition team members. A good number of them are folks who had senior labor and employment positions within the Department of Labor and EOC during the Obama administration, and some are pretty known. And so Seth Harris was the Deputy Secretary of Labor. Patricia Smith was the Solicitor of Labor. Jenny Yang was the Vice Chair of the EOC. And then some others are very just well-known quantities in different substantive areas on DOL issues. For example, Jocelyn Fry, who's also with CAP, Center for American Progress, she's been around for many years working on equal employment opportunity issues. She's testified before the EOC, before Congress, and is a regular commenter on OCCP policy positions. And some of there's some papers that she's already published since the election, giving like an overview of the types of things that she would recommend. For example, just some of them are very common, like, well, you should increase the funding to the Federal Enforcement Agency, but then there's others like picking up on, some kind of pay data reporting obligation, some greater types of initiatives that's similar to the kind of blacklisting executive order. And then same with Jenny Yang. She's who's the former EOC chair. She's been publishing with the Urban Institute on various EO topics that are public, and some of her concerns have been since the election and suggesting the focus should be on occupational segregation issues, intersectional discrimination, like race and gender intersect. And then the concern about the use of technology devices in the workplace for screening, like big data algorithms for hiring practices. So on to the EOC. The only thing I think that's really noteworthy there. We don't have any, picks that or suggested nominations. It's a full slate. There's not going to be an opening until 21, and it looks like it's hard to imagine how this will flip from being Republican based on the dates in which people their term expires, short of somebody resigning before their term ends. But sometimes you can see these things coming through like in a package deal, 2-1. But even if you envisioned a package deal coming through in 22 when that would be available, that still would leave a 3-2 Republican majority. Now the chair will shift, and the president can pick the chair and move that from Janet Dillon to Charlotte Burrows, and the chair controls the agenda. So maybe that would make the Republican majority less, kind of make it inert, but there probably would be a way for the Chamber of Commerce and other business groups to tee things up on the agenda through certain types of rulemaking or other regulatory petitions that they could tee up that would try to force and give a vehicle for the Republicans to exert their majority power. Obviously, if the Senate flips and there's no nomination filibuster, then probably in 22 there could be an opportunity to flip the DOC once Dillon would her term would expire. The NLRB is somewhat in the same boat. There's 3 Republicans, 1 Democrat. There's 1 vacant seat, the so-called Carmody seat that would be a term expiring August 27 of 2023. Who knows whether in the lame dunk Trump would try to put somebody in there and have that confirmed. It seems like most of that effort, in its controversial effort in the Senate right now, is on judicial confirmations, and it looks like that's not going to abate in terms of pursuing judicial nominations in the Senate, including Thomas Kirsch in the 7th Circuit to replace Amy Coney Barrett on the 7th Circuit. So it's more likely that would remain vacant, and so there's going to be more opportunity for Biden after, depending on the control of the Senate, after 21, so next summer, with the vacancy and Bill Emanuel's seat to maybe flip. But if it's a package deal, then it becomes a bit harder because a 1-1 would still make a Republican majority. So, and a 2-1 wouldn't work until, I guess that would be 2022 when John Ring his seat expires. So, Edward, now on to the Secretary of Labor, and I think you're going to tell us who that's going to be, right?
I'll try. So there are a number of candidates who have been mentioned to take the reins as Secretary of Labor. I think 3 in particular, we'll talk briefly about today. I'm sure most of you have seen the rag mags, and they're talking about Marty Walsh and the relationship that he has with President-elect Biden. Here he has wide-ranging support, as you can see from the AFL-CIO, and there is a big push for him to be in the role of Secretary of Labor. Outside of that, Andy Levin, who is a House representative, son and nephew of a veteran senator and House representative member, also has wide-ranging support from a few of the unions. And so there's a push there for him to be Secretary of Labor as well. I want to talk a little bit about Seth Harris, who was former acting Secretary of Labor during the Obama administration. Seth Harris, he's been doing a lot of interviews. He has a great relationship with Joe Biden. And, many see him as being more of a centrist and somebody who can get things done in the event that there is a Republican majority in the House. And so, in the Senate. And so many believe he'll just fare well in the role. And so we've been keeping our eyes open there. Julie Su, who's a current Secretary of California, has been getting a lot of support in the state, but I don't know if she's really garnering much support nationally. Although I've been seeing this week a number of reports saying that she's likely to get the role. So we'll see. Outside of that, I'll skip down to Bernie Sanders because I think a lot of people are wondering whether or not he has a chance at being the Secretary of Labor, and that's a looming question. What I will say is that Biden was pretty clear, I think, last week when he said he won't take Sanders or Warren from their Senate seats, and for right reason. Bernie Sanders, I think, is rising in seniority, I think, on the Budget Committee, and so he can likely chair the Budget Committee. But then Warren, we have to remember, is from a Republican state, and so if she left the Senate with a Republican governor, we would have to wonder whether or not a Republican will fill that seat, and so that puts things in perspective with regard to those two. I'll say William Spriggs is a career labor person. I have not heard much about him other than he has been honorably mentioned, as well as Sarah Nelson and Sharon Block. One other person that Bill was gracious to mention today earlier as we were prepping for this was Abby Finkenauer, who is a congresswoman, was a congresswoman from Iowa, a Democratic congresswoman. She actually lost her seat. She won the election pretty narrowly in 2018, and so she lost her seat, but is being talked about as potential to fill this role. Now, whether or not she makes it, I really don't know. I will say she was assigned to the Small Business Committee, did good work there, very, very respected in the agricultural community, but I'm not really sure if she has a wide range of support of the labor community. And so with that, Bill or Brian, do you have anything to add on these potential candidates?
No, this is Brian. I think that's a great overview, Edward. It's hard to know what to make of the chatter, to be honest. It seems to change daily, to change daily depending on what news site you happen to take a look at or what newspaper you read. I'm sort of like you. Most of the chatter I've heard tends to be around Marty Walsh, but a lot of it also depends on how people are reacting to the other cabinet appointments and how much pressure the Biden administration is going to feel about sort of needing to sort of balance out picks. So we'll just need to see. I think it's all up in the air, and in fact, I think there's some chatter about whether or not he might hold off on a particular pick or two, depending on the outcome of the Senate. And so we may not know this for some time. Anything else, Edward, before we move on? Or?
Nope, feel free.
Okay. Well, let's go ahead and transition now to talk a little bit about some executive orders and regulatory and other enforcement priorities separate from staffing. We know some about staffing. We can project a little bit. There are certain things, especially with the EEOC and the NLRB, that we definitely know with respect to terms and transitions there. But we do know a good bit about enforcement priorities because you could look at the Democratic National Platform, you could look at Biden administration briefing papers, you could look at speeches and other pronunciations that have come out of the campaign over the last 2.5, 3 years. And you could definitely get a sense of sort of where things are going. And there is no doubt that if the new administration wants to move quickly, executive orders, frankly, are going to be at the top of the batting order. And the reason for that is obviously, unlike legislation that takes time and a good bit of effort and money, and or administrative rulemaking, which has formal processes and vetting and comment periods, and which takes a good bit of time, and there's legal structures around all that. Executive orders, well, it's a little bit more loosey-goosey. It only typically applies to federal contractors and subcontractors, but the ability of the administration to revoke an executive order, to reinstitute prior executive orders, to the extent possible that have been rescinded, to issue new executive orders, and to modify things around the edges via agency guidance. Well, they can definitely move quicker on that than other things. So what are we hearing? What are we seeing? One of the main things, obviously, that's probably up to the top of the list is the recent executive order that came out of the Trump administration, Executive Order 13950, officially titled Combating Race and Sex Stereotyping. It's actually, however, a executive order that prohibits certain diversity and sensitivity training by federal contractors and subcontractors that's deemed to be divisive or race or sex scapegoating as defined in the regulations. As you can imagine, since a lot of organizations engage in a wide variety of D&I training on all sorts of good levels, this is highly controversial. From the get-go, it's not automatically effective. It only applies to certain contractors and subcontractors, with a contract coming up here this past November. But I think the chatter is this will be on the chopping block almost immediately when the Biden administration takes office, and you can expect to see that fall within the first 2 weeks. There's also a fair amount of chatter about whether the administration is simply going to flip it and issue a different executive order that in fact requires specified diversity and inclusion or implicit bias training. So we'll need to look for that. But certainly the end of 13950 is likely quickly upon us. Other things we've heard a lot of questions about, there was, people may recall, a Fair Pay and Safe Workplaces Executive Order 13673 under the prior administration, also known derisively as the blacklisting rule. It's referred to that way because it required self-reporting by federal contractors and subcontractors of certain things that the DOL deemed to be, quote, violations of 14 separate different federal labor and employment laws. And not only were you going to have to self-report this up to the federal government on a periodic basis, but agencies were then going to use that data when making contract awards, basically determining whether they thought you were a good Boy Scout or a bad Boy Scout, and take that into consideration with federal dollars. That was highly controversial, as you can imagine. It suffered a lot of input and challenge related to that, and it was eventually killed. And you might think, well, why can't they simply resurrect it? And they certainly might try to, but I think it's important to keep in mind that unlike some executive orders that simply went away, this executive order got challenged through a 2017 joint resolution that disapproved the regulation, in particular under the Congressional Review Act. And that's significant because the Congressional Review Act has a provision in it that says that once a rule is undone through that legislative mechanism, it cannot be, quote, reissued in substantially the same form. So is it possible that this may come back? Yes. I mean, we heard a lot of chatter about interest in this from the Biden administration, but is it going to be easy to come back? No, and to the extent it does come back, it's probably going to suffer a fair amount of legal challenge. Other things that are on deck, joint employer status. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but just know there's been a lot of movement in this area. The DOL had a final rule that came out that's already subject to federal challenge with an ongoing appeal. The National Labor Relations Board issued its final rule that was effective April the 20th that reversed the Browning-Ferris decision. The EEOC talked about back in November 2009 issuing a proposed rule, but has yet to do so. A lot of chatter has been out there about whether or not the administration may try and synthesize sort of one sort of more unified joint employer status rule among the agencies. And that's possible. If you're going to get some movement, it's probably going to be on the DOL level first, in part because undoing the final rule on the National Labor Relations side is going to be harder. And you don't have to deal with a board to do so. You have political appointees who can help you with that. But it's also helpful for people to keep in mind that we're probably not going to get lucky enough to have a truly uniform standard, in part because technically the definition of employer under a variety of different regulations under the DOL, the EEOC, the NLRB varies. And because of that variation, even though it may be slight in some circumstances, sometimes the rules that come out of these agencies vary as well. So I'm not really expecting any kind of uniformity. It would certainly be nice. But if we're going to see an attack, it's probably going to be coming at the DOL level first. Other things we're expecting to see, independent contractor status. DOL issued a proposed rule in September 20th. That comment period ended at the end of October. By all indications, the Trump administration is trying to push quickly to finalize a rule before the end of the administration. If that happens, will there be an attempt to sort of vacate it under the Congressional Review Act? Possibly, but again, that depends on control of the Senate. And so unless things change, that's probably unlikely. But we do know that to the extent the Biden administration can, they would like to broaden that definition. They are not real keen on the current DOL proposal or the economic realities test in general. And so to the extent that they can sort of dabble around the edges, do we think they're going to try and shift things more towards, for example, California's controversial ABC test? You bet. We definitely think that's probably the case. Other things that we've heard a lot of questions about, EEO pay data reporting, God forbid, is it going to come back? As people will recall, this suffered a lot of challenge and a lot of litigation. This is the requirement for private employers and federal contractors with 100 or more employees to submit a variety of pay data in aggregate form based on compensation and hours worked by gender and race into 10 separate categories along 12 different pay bands with all sorts of other bells and whistles that I won't bore you with, but it was very controversial in part because the data was fairly worthless. Because it was fairly worthless, it got a lot of challenge and a lot of pushback. And if you recall, data was eventually submitted for 2017 and 2018. But then in March 2020, the EEOC, having a newly constituted Republican majority on the commission, said we do not intend to seek OMB approval for 2019, 2020, or 2021 collection. So there we go. And so everybody breathed a sigh of relief until the election. And so the concern now is, can they resurrect this? Possibly, but keep in mind, as Bill and Edward talked about before, they don't have a majority on the commission to do this. Unlike the DOL, who does have political appointees at the top, there are appointees at the commission and the National Labor Relations Board, but it's a balanced board, a balanced commission. And so it's going to be a while before the EEOC is going to have a majority to sort of resurrect EEO1 Component 2 to the extent they want to do that. So what could the Biden administration do? Well, I guess they could possibly try and do some sort of executive order for federal contractors and subcontractors through their executive order power. There might be some sort of talk about reviving OFCCP's 2014 compensation data collection tool proposal. That proposal was tabled in part because of the Component 2 effort through EEOC. So we'll just have to see. But the short answer, I think, for the moment is for the majority of employers, I think we've got some breathing room on EEO1 Component 2. So with that, let me just flip it back over to Bill. Bill, you want to talk about some other things that we're hearing?
Sure. So this AAP certification is something, collection proposal was something that was teed up in the Trump administration. I think it was kind of thought that this, the expectation was that President Trump would be reelected, and therefore that there would be, control over this regulatory vehicle of this certification, and it was supported by some business side commenters under the theory that if you had a widespread certification requirement where all federal contractors and subcontractors had to certify that they completed their annual affirmative action programs, that the agency then could focus on mid-size and smaller firms that might not certify, might not have complied, and therefore it would take the pressure on audits away from the bigger federal contractors who generally are, quite in compliance with the affirmative action program requirements. That's a very vague requirement, and it's not being undertaken through rulemaking. And in fact, the agency claims that it has the authority to do it without rulemaking, which is highly questionable. So they've just used the Paperwork Reduction Act (OMB) approval process for the AAP certification as a data collection, information collection request. And that still requires notice and comment, but it's not the same degree of comment and analysis as with rulemaking. But in any event, the OFCCP published this information collection proposal in the Federal Register, and they requested comments on 3 options. 2 of the options involve a certification, and 1 involves an actual upload of everybody's affirmative action programs. The comment period is already closed. McGuire Woods filed comments and generally opposed it because it's so vague, and there were a lot of practical problems and also due process problems with the vagueness in terms of certifications these days are really have a heightened concern, especially with publicly traded entities, and so it's really important that you know exactly what you're certifying to, so that the certification is accurate. And this thing was way too vague to permit that kind of knowing certification that was really accurate. So other commenters suggested this would still be an appropriate thing to do. I think the concerning thing for federal contractors and subcontractors now is that this is a regulatory vehicle that tees up something in the Biden administration as a first opportunity to make a substantial regulatory change viewed as pro-enforcement. And if you recall, the Obama transition team had recommended in a policy paper authored, I think, by Cyrus Mary and some others back in 2008 timeframe, that OCCP actually considered an annual upload of affirmative action programs. So this could come to fruition. I mean, there's going to be the ability to use this regulatory vehicle to issue a final rule that says, yes, go ahead and upload your AAPs or a substantial number of AAPs. So there's going to be another round of notice and comment opportunity under the OMB PRA process. So I would just recommend the contractors and subcontractors watch this issue really carefully, because it's not going to be the political appointees who are going to be in charge of the final outcome of this are not going to be the same folks who proposed it, where we might have had a better comfort level in it be landing on some kind of reasonable and confined certification. We expect right away, and you've already seen commentary on this by some of the folks like Jocelyn Fry and some of the discussion before the House Workforce Committee on going back, getting rid of the OCCP comp standard that is imposed through Directive 2018-05 and going back to the Directive 307 approach that involves, really more aggregated regression models and highly controversial approach, a much broader view of who are similarly situated employees whose pay can be compared. And so we would expect that this is something that they can do very quickly in making that rescission, within the first 6 or 9, maybe definitely first year, you would expect to see that kind of a change. Now, it's interesting. It might be more subject to regulatory challenge in federal court, because there have been a lot of flip-flops on this, and usually regulatory challenges do better where the agency has gone back and forth a number of times on an issue in diametrically opposed ways. And there are we'll talk about some federal courts that wouldn't be receptive to those kinds of challenges. OCCP just issued right after, 2 days after the election, 3 days after the election, a final rule that addresses and provides governing standards for issuing notices of violation and predetermination notices. And the final rule basically locks in a position that is an enforceable requirement. So if OCCP does not follow the final rule, contractors would have the ability to go into federal court to force them to follow the final rule because it's a legislative rule and it's binding with the force and effect of law. And it makes OCCP follow certain legal standards in the types of cases it pursues discrimination violations that it wants to present in a PDN and NOV, and it has to give the contractor certain information that will allow the contractor enough the ability to try to effectively respond and rebut the allegations. And so this is really important development because it will somewhat ensure that federal contractors have mechanisms during audits over the next year and before some regulations can be changed or guidance can be changed. It gives them an opportunity to have kind of self-help to avoid really aggressive legal theories being implemented through audits. And we would expect that the OCCP will try to rescind this and put that on the top of its rulemaking list, but that will require rulemaking, and it will be somewhat uncomfortable because it could tee up an APA review challenge of any rescission that would place really squarely in front of a reviewing court very controversial OCCP policy positions, like issuing a PDN or NOV accusing an employer of a disparate impact violation without ever identifying the challenged employment practice. A reviewing court is going to find that impossible to square with Title VII and with the governing law, and so that's going to be awkward if the Biden administration wants to try to get rid of this final rule. Brian, I think it's over to you now.
Sure, thank you, Bill. So folks, you may be thinking about now, gee, that's a lot. And the other thing you're probably thinking is, does Amazon ship bourbon? And the short answer is no, but wish they did. But, you know, in addition to the other things that we have been talking about, unfortunately, there's a lot of other things that you've probably heard some chatter about as well, just to sort of bring them to your attention so that you can think ahead and can plan a little bit. Here's just a short overview of a few of them. First and foremost, there's been a lot of time about a lot of talk about overtime itself. As you know, the salary threshold standard was one thing under the Obama administration, was revised under the Trump administration. Will it possibly be revised yet again under the Biden administration? I think probably so, that it's going to take rulemaking to do it. Federal minimum wage, obviously this has been a big issue for a long time for a number of different people. And there's going to be a lot of pressure to try and sort of move the dial on that over a multi-year period if possible. Paid FMLA leave has been something that's popped up on both sides of the aisle for some time. Frankly, it's gotten a little extra traction this year because there was a paid emergency FMLA approach under FCRA, under the Family First Coronavirus Relief Act, for the first time. And, you know, whether something pops out of it in a similar kind of mechanism, we'll have to see. But certainly there's a lot of pressure to do this, in part because, frankly, a lot of state and local governments have already taken paid leave approaches, and there's a desire at some level by many employers to try and get uniformity to the extent possible. So we expect to see some movement on that. Expect to see a lot of movement or attempted movement on union organizing rules. This has been going to be certainly a push to try and restore elements of ambush elections. There's some decisions that some folks are not keen on related to union access to email data and phone numbers for individual employees as part of organizing, the use of company equipment and email itself as part of a campaign, whether or not undergraduate and graduate students performing services for compensation can be unionized as, quote, employees versus students proper. And certainly the ban on secondary boycotts has always been a chafing issue for a lot of folks that they would like to address how much they can actually do it. Given the NLRB structure at the moment, we'll have to see. But certainly that won't take immediate time, but we expect to see some shifting sand on that to the extent that the administration can get traction. Other things, obviously, one thing I think we can definitely expect to see out of the box is some type of emergency OSHA COVID-19 temporary standard. Believe it or not, there is not one. There's been a lot of COVID guidance, obviously, from the CDC and others, and there's been some OSHA input, but there hasn't been really a uniform COVID-19 temporary standard in OSHA. And I think the Biden administration is going to make that a definite priority, and we will probably see that very early on. I don't think there's any doubt, though, that under the General Duties Clause, a lot of the, quote, guidance that's out there is going to try and get weaponized into a general duties obligation. And so even though OSHA has been fairly quiet on the enforcement front with respect to COVID-19, you can probably expect that not to continue in 2021. Likewise, other things we've heard, certainly Biden administration and others aren't too keen about mandatory arbitration. That may be on the chopping block, or at least up to the extent that they can try and limit that. Non-compete and anti-rating no poaching agreements is a
Brian, I think you went on mute there.
I think Brian might have dropped off.
Yeah, sorry. So yes. We'll move on to the immediate and practical implications for 2020. We talked a little bit earlier about the Georgia Senate race, but I guess all roads lead to Georgia here. The Senate race will be held on January 5th, 2021. So mark your calendars. And I think this election has a number of implications. One, the extent to which initial policy action is shaped via executive order versus regulation or legislation. The scope and applicability of any policy change to federal contractors versus private and public employers generally. The speed of appointments and Senate confirmation. If we see a number of sort of out of the box folks or progressives, I mean, we're likely to see some opposition there. So I think some things are, we're still, again, waiting to see, because if Biden picks some of the veteran Obama administration folks, we're likely to see them to be confirmed a little bit easier than, somebody with less experience or less relationship. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. Something to note is, of course, the 6 federal circuit courts are now controlled by judicial appointees who are more receptive to regulatory challenges brought by business. So, that's something that Bill has made note of, and so, Bill, did you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think that would that could serve 2 roles. It could serve as a general check that would make the administration not want to take on certain regulatory actions, or if they prove to be kind of aggressive, then you definitely are going to see a lot of regulatory challenges, because there definitely is a receptive federal judiciary up and down. There's plenty of places for business to go with regulatory challenges, with a significant optimism for success against aggressive policies.
Bill, can you want to talk a little bit about the L&E risk? I don't know if Brian dropped off or he's back.
I think we covered most of these ideas in some of the personnel discussions we had earlier, and the discussion of the agency enforcement posture. I think one of the things that's interesting is if you look at the end of that slide, the Trump administration and OFCCP, as an example, wasn't necessarily to call the Trump administration's OFCCP less aggressive or rolling back the clock on equal employment opportunity enforcement. I think that would be really wrong. If you look at what's actually been happening on the ground in audits and their settlement activity and their litigation activity, that's absolutely not true. They've been pretty aggressive and even pursuing very aggressive legal theories in litigation. Now, they have lost a bunch of those cases before Department of ALJs, but nonetheless, they've pursued pretty aggressive positions. And so some of this might be not that big of a change from what we've seen in the Trump administration, except for more, broader audits and more standards, enforcement standards that are a bit more aggressive. The next slide is kind of what our kind of two recommendations here to close this out. You want to review your compliance posture, given the types of things that we expect coming down the pike, and that we've talked about. I think that most employers are probably trying to get through the pandemic and reemerge from the pandemic as the first order of business. But we'll start to see more specifics with regard to particular personnel who are political appointees in these key roles that we've talked about, and then what types of policy proposals start emanating out of DOL. We would expect that that's going to start. It'll roll down from the nomination of the DOL secretary, but then you'll see over time, and probably it won't be until next summer that you start seeing significant changes that are not changes related to specifically to COVID issues. So I think there's some time, and the focus will be on COVID recovery in the short term. But there is some time and some consideration that employers should be giving to how they're going to evaluate their compliance and be able to react to the coming changes that are highly likely starting in next summer. So the next slide, I think, is yours, Edward, and basically the types of things that, our consulting arm can help employers with in terms of trying to help shape these policy and perhaps legislative initiatives.
Certainly. I think we've come almost to the conclusion of our presentation here. But as Bill mentioned, McGuire Woods does have a consulting arm of the law firm. We have a robust federal practice located here in Washington, D.C., where our consultants have relationships, deep relationships in the Biden administration, in the House, and the Senate. Personally, I'm a House lobbyist, but I have very strong relationships in House Democratic leadership as well as all of the committees, really. But of course, for your purposes, education and labor. And so, we're here to help in any way. And so if you have questions, concerns, or you're looking to build deeper relationships in the administration, you have our information, and please don't hesitate to reach out. One thing I think we wanted to do is to have one question. And so is Brian back yet? Or if not,
yeah, I'm back.
If not,
Edward, can you hear me?
Okay, great. There we go.
Yeah,
there we
sorry,
go. Hey, Brian.
sorry, folks. I'm not sure. Like everything else with 2020, technology is lovely. So sorry about dropping off earlier, but yeah, I'm back. So yeah, we did have one question I'll just throw out to y'all before we wrap up, and thanks again, everybody, for joining. The question was more general about timing, Edward, and it was a question about, how much time after January 20th do you think employers will have before they need to digest, and the person said significant compliance changes. You have a sense
Sure.
of that from your perspective?
Sure. I would say, as far as employers, I think you can rest easy a little bit. I don't see sweeping changes right away. And I also think, again, the Georgia Senate race will determine a host of different things. What I will say is if there is a Democratic majority, you're still likely to see some challenges, right? But I think as far as, where Biden would like to go to things, I think COVID and OSHA and a number of different things will be priority. I think in reassuring the public, ensuring that there's a safe vaccine distribution, those will be key things at the start of his term. And so I think we can likely see some labor changes maybe in the middle of next year. But for right now, I would say there's going to be a heavy emphasis placed on safe administration of the vaccine and ensuring that employees have the right safety measures set in place for them to even come back to the workforce. And so to shortly answer your question, I think it's going to be a little bit of time before we see, again, some sweeping changes.
Okay. Excellent. Well, Bill, thank you. Thank you, Edward, as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining in. We know you have an amazingly busy schedule this time of year, and what has overall been an amazingly busy and crazy 2020. We're all hoping that 2021 will be lesser with respect to stress and everything else that we're faced with. But if we can help you in any way with that, certainly let Edward or Bill or myself or anybody else on our teams know. And certainly if you have questions about this, I know we didn't get a chance to get to many questions. We will follow up with individuals one-on-one about questions that were submitted on the platform. Thank you for doing that. But certainly feel free to email myself, email Bill, email Edward individually or collectively, and we'll be glad to lend a hand in any way we can. With that, we will end today. Thank you, and we hope
you
have
everybody.
a safe rest of the week.